Well, hello. We just finished the Pentateuch, and so I wanted to make a video that really focuses on the relevance of the Pentateuch to our lives today. But for us to do that, we have to understand first the relevance of the Pentateuch to the people that Moses was actually addressing. And so we're going to try to blend those two worlds. And so we're going to look at the Bible and the story, and that would be then. And then we're going to look at the theology that comes out of that. And the theology is sort of like a bridge, and it'll bridge the then with the now. And then we're going to look at the application, which is the significance both for them, but also more importantly, right now for us in our daily lives. So I will begin by sharing my screen. And we will begin also with a very familiar diagram here, as you see now on your screen. And that diagram helps us to understand that we have this flow, we said, of story. So we're looking at the structure, and then the labels then form the rudiments of the actual story itself. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on that blue box, which we call the Pentateuch, and that's the first 5 books of the Bible. So in that we have the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so specifically what I want to do is work our way through each of those elements that we've been looking at. So that would be creation, then fall, then primeval, and then patriarchal bondage and the wandering. And what we're actually looking at is the question or the statement here. What is the purpose of the Pentateuch? And it is the formation of a nation to bring salvation to the world. What Moses was after and what he was tasked to do was God was going to use him to communicate to this nation as they are about to move into the land, because we know Moses never makes it into the land. And so we also know that Moses died before he went into the land. And therefore he had to have written this prior to that, all those events. And he was writing it to the people who were going to go into the land. And really that's the second generation. And their purpose was very clearly that God was going to fulfill his promise to Abraham, form a nation, and in that nation would then be at the crossroads of the world and bring salvation to the world. Well, obviously, just in a very broad sense, that has tremendous implications for us today because we stand at the crossroads of people's lives. And so whether it's at our workplace or our home, we are at the point of an intersection in the lives of people who don't know Jesus Christ. And God has given us the same task that he did the nation, which is to bring salvation to those people or to the world. And so I believe that you're taking this seriously, and that's why you're part of this class. And so that's why I want to make this video. So what I want to do now is just walk through each of these, the creation, fall, primeval, patriarchal bondage, and wandering. And I want us to look at 3 aspects: the Bible, and so that's the then. And then I want us to look at the theology. And the theology you can think of as a bridge that connects the then with the now. And then finally, we want to look at how does that actually apply to each of our lives. So let's begin with the first part of the story, which is Genesis 1 and 2, the creation. And so when we look at the structure, it's right there. It's just a creation bubble. We've been going over that over the last 2 weeks. And then with the story sort of goes like this, that Moses is addressing the people. He's wanting them to understand that they live amongst a pagan people, pagan nations around them, the ancient Near Eastern cultures around them, who had gods for everything. So they were polytheists, but they had gods for fertility. They had gods for the rain and the sun and the moon and the stars. They had gods for the rivers and the fishing that was going to come out of those rivers, but they needed a God for every one of those areas, every one of those domains. And so what Moses does for these people that are about to go and become this great nation, fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham, is to say this: you believe in me, the one God who is over all things, right? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so God is over the heavens and the earth. He's over all things, meaning that he's greater than all the other gods. So that was the first part of the story we looked at. Then the next part of the story we looked at was in Genesis 1:2, right? And it said that the world was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. And we said those were the initial conditions. And what we're going to see then from Genesis 3 all the way through Genesis 2:3 is that God is going to give the world first form, and then he's going to fill it, because in Genesis 1:2 it said it was formless and it was void or empty. And so in those chapters, in the first 3 days of creation, God is going to give it form, the world, and then in the next 3 days he is going to fill that form. And part of the reason why he is doing that is to help the nation to understand what their role would be in the world. Because in Genesis 1:2, God is going to take the chaotic elements of this beginning part of the creation that he creates in order to then unfold the first 6 days of creation to show mankind what his responsibility would be in the world, but also to obviously to show that he is greater than all the other gods. And so God first gives it form on day one, right? He creates the light. On day two, he then creates the waters above from the waters below. On day three, then he creates the land and the sea. And then what happens is in that, then that's the form. That's the basic form that we have. And then what he's going to do is he's going to fill that. So he gives the stars and the moons and the sun on day four, which fills the form of day one. And then the next one, he puts the fish below and the birds above, and that fills the atmosphere above and the atmosphere below, or the waters above and the waters below. So he fills the form that he did in day two. And finally, in day six, he is going to fill the world with animals and crawling things, but also man and God as the image of God. And again, because this is to the nation of Israel, it's really important for us to try to see it through their perspective. And so the point of this story is, okay, now that you understand that God is the God over all the ancient Near Eastern gods, and you understand that he was going to first give form and then fill, I am now going to introduce to you, this is Moses speaking to them, what it means for you to be the image of God, because their cultural neighbors, all these ancient Near Eastern cultures, they also had this concept of the image of God, but only the leader or the king would be the one who had the image of God. And so God is going to destroy that paradigm, and he's going to say, no, all of you, okay, Genesis 1:26 through 28, that the man and the woman are equally the image of God. You all have the image of God. And so the first thing that they have to realize is that there is no ordinary people, because we all have this thing called the image of God. The second thing is that the man and the woman are equal in their essence, because they are equally the image of God. And then the third thing we need to understand is that the image of God not only is a noun, meaning that's our essence or their essence, but the second thing is it's something they were supposed to do, right? Be fruitful, multiply, fill. And as you do that, we want you to subdue and rule over the world. Well, that's the exact opposite, but the same major elements that God did when he was creating the world. God has given man a perfect but unfinished product, and he wants man to now fill that. And as man fills the earth, he then is supposed to subdue and rule or bring transformation. He's to reform it into what God originally was going to have it. Or to extend, we said, the borders of the garden, so that the garden, the conditions inside the garden, the presence of God in the garden would then be extended to the outer parts of the garden, which were still needing to be transformed. And so that begins to help us to understand that for man, there's two aspects of man as the image of God. One, and this now we're moving into the theology, that as the image of God, that man in his essence, he is the image of God. And therefore, that never, I believe, changed at the fall. That the essence of who we are as a person never changes. And that's why when you look and you continue on and you see in, whether it's in Genesis 9 or you go to James 3, you see that the unbelievers, the fallen creation, that we still, as human beings, still possess the image of God. But then there's a second aspect of the image of God that we see in Genesis 1:26 through 28, and that's the issue of ruling, right? That we are to rule over the creation on behalf of God. And so that was definitely affected. Because if we define what it means for man to be the image of God, is that it's man and the woman are to represent God and his interests, not our own, but his interests in turning chaos, human chaos in particular, right? We're very good at that, into divine order. And that is why we need to understand who God is, understand the scriptures, so that we can then say, okay, well, this is what God intended. Let's move our world towards that direction. Okay, the second theological thing, so that was the image of God, both our essence, but also our ability to do. Our essence hasn't changed because of the fall, but our ability to actually carry out the image of God has completely changed because we no longer want to do that because we want to do our own thing. Okay, the second thing that we realize is we just see the nature of God. That God is sovereign over all things, He is in control of all things, and therefore it is only right that we then submit to Him. Well, none of that's changed for us today. We are the image of God, and as Christians, we are being restored more and more into the image of God. Not our essence, that has unchanged, okay? But our willingness to carry out what it was for us to be the image of God, to represent God in His interests, and to make those our first priority. So that's the creation. The next thing we look at is the fall. And certainly when the fall comes, the whole world is turned upside down. And we know that the structure of it is very simply that arrow that goes down. It's red to show us that there's danger, that there was a catastrophic problem that happens when the man and the woman rebel, which moves us into the story. We know that the serpent comes, that the serpent was created before the creation of the world. We see that in the book of Job. And then we also notice then that within this whole story that when the serpent comes in, the man should have immediately recognized, hey, you should not be here, you need to leave, because that was part of his role as the leader. Man does not do that. The woman then engages with the serpent. He then begins to take her through this deconstructing in a sense of who God is. Well, did God really say that? Is God really trustworthy? And he begins to put new ideas in her mind. And she then looks and says, everything that you've said is true about this tree. And so she takes and she eats and she gives to her husband, who must have been there in the area at some point. And I believe he must have been there from the beginning, and he should have removed the serpent, but he doesn't. And after she eats and then he eats, after he eats, the fall takes place. Okay, because he was the leader and therefore he's responsible. And we see that in Romans 5. Now, what is the story continues, right? Because then God is coming through the garden, his presence was there, and he points out the fact that they're no longer doing what they normally do because the man and the woman try to cover themselves with fig leaves. They hide themselves from God because they feel shame. It's the first time they've felt a negative type of emotion. And so God calls them out, and we know the story. There's a series of blaming where the man's going to blame the woman, the woman's going to blame the serpent, but God is going to say, you know what, all three of you are culpable, and here's the judgment against each one of you. For the serpent, he is going to be one day, well, first he's going to be humiliated. That's the idea of eating dust. But the second thing is that he is going to be crushed. His head is going to be crushed. He's going to be killed. He's going to be thrown into the lake of fire. It is his ultimate judgment. But that initial judgment takes place on the cross. When Jesus Christ dies, he destroys sin and he destroys the serpent and his eventual hold that he has upon the earth. Okay, and then so that then becomes the first evidence of the gospel, is all the way embedded in Genesis 3:15. Then we move from the judgment against the serpent to the judgment of the woman. And the woman's judgment takes two sides. One is that she is going to have difficulty, and this is in Genesis 3:16, from the time of trying to conceive all the way to giving birth. And we see that over and over again in the scriptures, from Sarah to Rebecca to Rachel. I mean, there's no shortage of women who are having difficulties getting pregnant. And then we also see, but it's not just the idea of conceiving, but it's all the way through giving birth. And we see that too, right? Because when Rachel gives birth to Benjamin, she dies. And so we'll always see Genesis 3 being played out throughout the Pentateuch. And so you want to keep that in mind. You want to look for some of those themes. Man is the image of God, God's rulership over the world, satanic attack, and how he wants to undermine the plan of God. And then thirdly, or the second thing we see with the woman, the second aspect of judgment is also focused on her ability to fulfill her role as the image of God. And that's not only to bear children, but the second one is that she's going to want to rule over her husband. In our world today, that's not a popular statement, but the reality is we can see that her desire is for her husband, but he's going to rule over her. You can tie that into the next chapter in 4:7, where we see that sin is crouching at the door and it's waiting to do what? To take control over Cain and to then rule over him. And that's exactly the same use that's used in the Genesis account with a woman. So those are two facets of the woman. She's going to have more difficulty from conception through birth, and she's going to want to control her husband. The second, the third judgment is against the man. And that comes again, and it comes in two parts also, and it's also going to affect his ability to fulfill his role as the image of God. And so the first one is that the very creation itself that he was supposed to have dominion over is going to now fight him, and that it's going to be much more difficult for him to fulfill what it was for him to do and to rule and to subdue and to rule over the world. And then the second thing is that even though he was created at the apex of creation, and that he was taken from the dust, you remember in 2:7, and God breathed the breath of life into him. Well, now he's going to return to that very dust, and it's going to show that man is going to work all his life incredibly hard, and the futility of life is it's going to end in him returning to the dust. And so the theological significance of the fall, it affects everything. It affects human beings and our ability then to image God. Well, we still are completely the images of God, but we now are unable to image him because we no longer want to represent God in his interests. We want to represent our own interests. That's exactly what Eve did. That's what Adam did. And as a result, we are now all in this situation. But within that, we always see grace. And that's the other theological element, that even though God brings these judgments upon man, there's grace that follows. And we see the grace of the fact that the man and the woman covered themselves with the fig leaves, but what God does is he says, no, that's not insufficient. So he has an animal killed and he gives them the skins. The skins, the blood of the animal had to be, where the life is, the animal had to give up its life so that the man and the woman could have a relationship with God. The second aspect we also see of God's grace is when he removes them from the garden, that he's protecting them from eating from the tree of life, so that they're not eternally lost. And so that God is both going to judge sin, but at the same point, he is also going to show grace and mercy upon humanity. And we can be thankful for that. And so when we think of the significance of the fall for ourselves, we have to realize it's like gravity, that the fall, it affects everything we do. It affects the way we think. It affects our world. It affects every other person in the world. And so what we need to do is recognize that the fall and its implications, whether it's on the environmental side, that we're never going to have a pristine, perfect environment on this side of heaven. And so we want to be responsible stewards of the world, but at the same time, we have dominion over the world and use it responsibly. But we also want to recognize that when our children are born into this world, that they're fallen human people. And so we want to train and raise them and to help them to understand as quickly as possible their own sin. And that's why we discipline them. That's why we establish boundaries. And that's why when they do sin, right, and we discipline them, the next thing we do is we receive them back, just like God receives humans back when they repent and they turn from their sin. We want to do that to our children because we're modeling the gospel. Okay? And so that's the second major theme or movement in the story of the Pentateuch. And again, keep in mind that Moses is trying to help these people to live amongst a pagan world to bring salvation to them. Okay, the third part then, oh, you know what I forgot? I just realized this, it's not in there, is the whole issue of the primeval period. And so the primeval period, I'll just leave it here, but imagine that box says primeval, was to show man just how wicked he was, right? We said there are two major events within the primeval period. We have Noah and the flood, and then we have the Tower of Babel, all of which were focused to resist God and to say, we don't want you to lead. We have rejected the fact that we're supposed to represent you and your interests in this world. And instead, we're going to show you what it looks like when we rule the world. So when you get to Genesis chapter 5 and you see the genealogy that it results in, and he died, and he died, and he died. Because God warned them, if you take from the tree, from the knowledge of good and evil, the time when you eat from it, you shall surely die. And so as we think about the primeval period, we need to think about, you know what? The effects of sin are very lasting in our world. And the fact that sin just has this desire to get progressively more and more powerful in a person's life. So when we yield to sin, we have to be very careful. And God's given us a wonderful way to not allow that sin to continue to get more and more power in our lives, right? And that's why, if If we do a little lie, then that little lie turns into a bigger lie, which turns into a bigger lie, which then becomes a way of life. Or if you start dabbling with sexual sin, it starts out small, but then it continues to grow and grow to where it dominates a person's life, whether that's premarital sex, whether that's pornography. It will always start out here, and it'll always want to have more and more control of your life. The key to all of that and to the primeval period for us, as we look at the significance, is this: that when you repent, you can undo all of this. That's the beauty of repentance, that God says you need to turn from your sin. And so repentance is you're moving this direction and you do a 180 and you move away from your sin and you look towards Christ and you now put your affections around Christ. Is either you're going to put your affections around the sin or you're going to put your affections around Christ, but you can't do both at the same time. And so this is one of the significant things for us to understand in that period of time. Okay, so we've now looked at the creation, we've looked at the fall, and now we've then looked at the issue of the primeval period. And now what we're going to do is move into the story of the bondage, the wilderness, and the wanderings. And this becomes an important period of time because God takes this nation at the end of Genesis of about 70 people and moves them down into Egypt, but he moves them into the Fertile Crescent, or not the Fertile Crescent, he moves them into the this farmland that is incredibly rich. But to be a farmer in the Egyptian culture was like a very low rung in society. And so the people actually did not want to relate or deal with the farmers. So they were actually in this part of the land where they were, in the Nile River Delta and all of its tributaries. The land was incredibly rich and incredibly fertile. And so they were left alone though, because they were like ostracized, nobody wanted to deal with them. And so God used that rich part of the land to multiply them. So you go from 70 to over 2 million people. Now, in that, when you have 2 million people, you're not going to be able to hide that. And Pharaoh becomes aware of that. And he, as a result, wants to start killing the baby boys. God then, through a series of events, first has Moses, born into the situation where he becomes a prince. Then he has him live in that situation. But then after at the end of his 40 years, he murders somebody. He has to then flee and he becomes a shepherd for 40 years in Midian. God speaks to him to the burning bush. You need to go back and release the people, go rescue the people. I will do that on your behalf. He goes back for the last 40 years of his life. And there's a battle royale between Pharaoh and his gods and the God of the universe. And clearly the God of the universe wins. Then there's a series of events in which Moses continues to go before Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And so there's the 10 plagues. Each of those plagues is a period of time or a focus where God is going to take on one of their gods and destroy them and show that he has power over them. And then finally you get to the 10th plague, and that's where the nation was supposed to put the blood over the lentils, over the frame of the door, and then on the sides. And when the angel of death would come, he would pass over them, and that they would experience salvation. And that's exactly what happens. That's in Exodus 12. The people then leave. They had already plundered the wealth from the Egyptians, what they're going to be using for the making of the tabernacle. And then God puts them into a corner, basically, because you have the Red Sea on one side, you have the mountains, and the people are trapped, and you've got the pursuing Pharaoh's army, because again, he doesn't repent. But God stands between them and the freedom that they have. Moses then strikes the water. We know that the sea is split. The people go through. When Pharaoh tries to follow, they're drowned. And all that to show that, again, the power of God to rescue sinful humanity out of sin, because Egypt is also often seen as sin. So he's rescuing them out of Egypt. He's rescuing them out of sin as a picture, as a precursor to the gospel, and that Jesus rescues the sinner out of sin. Okay, so then they are now in the wilderness, and they have an 11-day journey to get to the land, because we said under the time of Moses, when you think of Abraham, and God says, I'm going to make you a great nation. Well, they need 3 things. We said they needed people. They got that in this book, the book of Exodus. Then in this 11-day journey, God gives them, it should have taken 11 days, but over this next month, it's going to take them a month just to get to a point where they can go into the land. He gives them the law, and that's the book of Leviticus. So now we have people in law. And so then we get to the book of Numbers, and our expectation as the reader is simply, oh my, they're going to get the land. This is awesome. And God is going to fulfill this promise to the nation that you are going to be a beacon to all the other nations. But the problem is the people see the giants, they don't see the size of their God. And as a result, they listen to the 10 spies who give a negative report, even though they say the land's exactly like God said it would be. They don't listen to Caleb and Joshua, and as a result, they don't enter into the land. And as a result, that trip that should have taken 11 days ends up taking 40 years. The first generation all die out during that period of time. And then we get to Deuteronomy, and we'll see what that's going to happen there. So in this, though, when you get to the book of Deuteronomy, it's the second giving of law to the second generation, because the second generation needs to understand that, okay, this is the history of where you came from. This is why your parents ended up dying. Here's the law re-given to you, including the 10 commandments and what those mean. And then here's what the future is going to look like. We know at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy that as the second generation is poised to go in and to become this nation, which is going to be a beacon to all the other nations, that Moses in his anger strikes the rock rather than speaking to the rock. And as a result, he doesn't get to go into the land. He can only look at it from the precipice above, and that Joshua will then bring the people in. Theologically, God takes sin seriously, and that the wage for sin is death. But that God, in the midst of that judgment, still shows grace, and that's why the second generation gets an opportunity to go in. The application for us today, very clearly, is that if you have experienced forgiveness through Jesus Christ, then you and I stand at the crossroads of people's lives. We have been transformed. We now not only are the images of God, but we can image God by representing him in his interests. He may have strategically placed you in a workplace or as a homemaker or in your neighborhood or when you're intersecting with people that you do business with. All of these are opportunities for us to be beacons of light and hope and to point people towards Christ, because that's what the nation was supposed to do. They were to represent God in his interest. And as they moved through this whole wilderness and received the law and they had the tabernacle, the surrounding peoples would see them and say, this is the nature of who God is and his people. And they could see God through them. And so we have the opportunity to make the invisible God visible and to introduce people to Jesus Christ before they've actually met him. And so when we think about the Pentateuch and the fact that Moses was getting the people ready to be a nation, and not just a nation to be a nation, but to be a redemptive nation, to be a redemptive window where the people in the world, the surrounding ancient Near Eastern pagan cultures, could see God in their midst and see God through their actions because of how they chose to order their lives. And therefore, they could come and to receive salvation like Rahab and her family do, or Ruth and her family do, who are very much from pagan nations. And so we have that same opportunity in our world today, that we live amongst a pagan people of which we once were. And so we are beggars, simply showing other beggars where to find food. And so I hope that this brief summary of the Pentateuch and its structure, story, significance, that it really does minister to your soul, that you can see that the Old Testament, in particular the Pentateuch, is incredibly relevant for how you choose to live your life today and tomorrow and for the rest of the days that God gives you. So may the Lord bless you, and may this encourage and empower and excite you to be about the mission that God has for you, to reach lost sinners with a saving message. The same message that has transformed your life can transform theirs. Thanks.